This is a special report from ABC News Digital.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ty Hernandez in New York with this ABC News Digital special report. The jury in the George Zimmerman trial is not in the courtroom today, as the judge is still not sure whether the jury should hear past phone calls made by George Zimmerman to the police. ABC's Lana Zach has more on the case.
Hi, Ty. You know, as we speak, the jury is actually now entering back into that courtroom as all eyes return to George Zimmerman.
George Zimmerman appeared stoic in court today as the prosecution argued that previous 911 calls should be played for the jury. At issue, half a dozen calls that the prosecution argues could reflect Zimmerman's state of mind prior to the night he shot and killed 17-year-old Trayvon Martin.
These calls are relevant. How the defense chooses to spin them is not.
It's not relevant just because the state says it is.
These phone calls, the prosecution argued, showed how Zimmerman's anger boiled up, leading to the expletive-filled 911 call on that fatal night.
Punks. These assholes, they always get away.
The judge says she will issue her ruling after court concludes today, giving her time to review case laws. Another call being discussed in court, Martin's female friend. She was on the phone with him when Zimmerman first approached.
Rachel Gentile heard Trayvon Martin say, "What are you following me for?" And then Trayvon Martin's phone went dead. And Trayvon Martin went dead.
Zimmerman's defense argued that Martin was using a piece of concrete as a weapon, and that Zimmerman was lucky to have had the gun on him.
Yes, he did have the gun, and thank God. Because at that moment, he was able to retrieve the gun when he couldn't take it anymore, when he'd been crying for help for 40 seconds.
The trial continues today in front of that all-female jury, which legal experts tell us is really quite unusual. Lana Zach, ABC News, New York.
All right, Lana, thank you. Now I want to bring ABC News radio correspondent Aaron Katersky, who is outside the courthouse in Stanford, Florida. Aaron, what's in these phone calls?
Well, these phone calls are in the months and even years before George Zimmerman ever met Trayvon Martin, but the prosecution is trying to show that George Zimmerman was predisposed to a vigilante form of justice, and they've called him a wannabe cop, somebody who was a little too persistent, somebody determined to get rid of people who were in his neighborhood that he didn't want there. And so they're putting on, or they want to put on, these phone calls to show that he had called police often in the months and years before the fateful encounter with Trayvon Martin. And those phone calls show that he called police. He talked about suspicious characters in his neighborhood. Often they were black, and sometimes they were teenagers. Sometimes those phone calls mirrored the one that he made the night he met Trayvon Martin. There's some suspicious character around, looks like a young black man in his teens, up to no good, and the prosecutors are trying to show that this was part of a pattern. The defense says, of course, these calls are not relevant.
The defense could argue, however, if they are let in, that essentially, George Zimmerman called police. This isn't the first time, but there was never any incident following those other phone calls. And in this case, they're arguing that it was Trayvon Martin who instigated, so there's a break in the pattern there.
That's right, and the defense is actually believes that these calls show George Zimmerman in a good light, doing what he was supposed to do as the neighborhood watch captain for his community, calling police if he saw something suspicious, and then not doing anything beyond that, behaving as the neighborhood watch volunteer should. But they still believe that ultimately the calls are not relevant, and they're trying to keep them out. It's going to be left to the judge to decide. She heard some argument earlier outside the presence of the jury. And then the case turned toward the Neighborhood Watch program, and the prosecution called the former coordinator of the Neighborhood Watch program for the Sanford Police Department, and she outlined the do's and don'ts of a Neighborhood Watch volunteer.
Now, this likely won't have any bearing on the judge's decision when it comes to George Zimmerman, but we should point out that she is not allowed the past of Trayvon Martin to be included in the case. In other words, any of his past behavior will not be included.
No, and prosecutors were adamant that Trayvon Martin is not the one on trial here, and therefore pictures of him in the past that portray him in a certain light, past behavior, isn't as relevant as the defense believes. They wanted to show a different side of Trayvon Martin than the ones we've seen in photographs of him as a smiling youngster. They wanted to portray him more as a thug, somebody who was prone to violence, somebody who smoked pot, somebody who was very interested in maybe violent video games or mixed martial arts, something like that, somebody who was out for trouble. And that's not the way the judge is going to allow Trayvon Martin to be portrayed. But in some cases, the defense can use some text messages or other kinds of electronic communications on a very limited basis.
Any testimony expected later today?
We're expecting a lot of testimony from a whole host of witnesses. Whether they get to them today, Taina, we're not quite sure. We still may get more testimony about the Neighborhood Watch program. There was a big sign put up in court that said Neighborhood Watch volunteers are not supposed to be the vigilante police. And the Neighborhood Watch coordinator testified that George Zimmerman was never told he was supposed to follow anybody as part of his duties, never told to pursue a confrontation. On cross-examination, she also conceded that he behaved pretty well, seemed like somebody concerned about his community, trying to make things better. We may get more about that. You heard Lana Zach talk about the friend of Trayvon Martin who was on the phone with him the night that he died. She has yet to testify, but from her, prosecutors are expected to elicit the fear that she says she heard in Trayvon Martin's voice.
All right, well, Aaron Satirski, interesting updates in the George Zimmerman trial. Thank you so much for joining us from Sanford, Florida. And you, of course, can read a complete write-up on the Zimmerman trial right here on abcnews.com. For now, I'm Ty Hernandez in New York. This has been an ABC News Digital Special Report.
This has been a special report from ABC News Digital.